When Jon Jones returned at UFC 285 and submitted Ciryl Gane in under 3 minutes, the debate seemed finished. The greatest fighter of all time had moved up to heavyweight, claimed the belt, and cemented his legacy. But just months later, in Manchester, Tom Aspinall blitzed Sergei Pavlovich in 69 seconds to seize the interim title, and suddenly the heavyweight crown looked contested. One man, a legend who ruled light heavyweight for a decade, now hunting history against Stipe Miocic. The other, a new breed of heavyweight, younger, faster, sharper, demanding his shot at the king. What should have been a dream unification fight has instead become a storm of call-outs, dismissal, and controversy. Is Jon Jones protecting his legacy? Or is Tom Aspinall, the heir apparent, being denied his moment? This isn't just a fight that hasn't happened. It's a battle over the future of heavyweight history. Jon Jones's decision to move up to heavyweight wasn't just another career choice. It was the culmination of a decade-long dominance at light heavyweight, and years of speculation from fans, analysts, and even his rivals. For years, whispers followed every Jones title defense. What if he fights at heavyweight? The idea loomed as the ultimate test. At light heavyweight, Jones had beaten generation after generation of contenders. Shogun Rua, Rashad Evans, Lyoto Machida, Daniel Cormier, Glover Teixeira, and more. No matter who stepped in front of him, Jones found a way to win. Sometimes it was dominant, sometimes it was razor close, but the result was always the same: Jon Jones's hand raised. But as time passed, new narratives emerged. Jones's personal life spiraled, drug test controversies, arrests, and suspensions that derailed his reign. Every time he returned, however, he proved the talent was still there. Still, fans began to wonder, had Jones finally run out of mountains to climb at light heavyweight? Even his closest victories, against Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes, sparked debate. Was Jones slipping, or was he simply unmotivated against opponents who couldn't truly threaten his legacy? That's when the heavyweight conversation reignited. Jones himself teased the move for years, bulking up in the gym, posting updates of his transformation. When he finally vacated the light heavyweight belt in 2020, it was clear he was leaving the division he ruled to chase something bigger. And not just bigger physically, bigger historically. Fast forward to March 2023. After 3 years away from competition, Jones walked into the cage at UFC 285 to face Ciryl Gane for the vacant heavyweight title. Many questioned whether the layoff and the weight gain would dull his sharpness. Instead, Jones silenced every doubt in under 3 minutes. He took Gane down effortlessly, controlled him with ease, and submitted him with a guillotine choke. It was shocking not because of the result, Jones was favored, but because of how easy he made it look. Years of anticipation ended in minutes, and suddenly, Jon Jones was the undisputed heavyweight champion. For Jones, the victory meant validation. He wasn't just the greatest light heavyweight of all time, he had now conquered the most dangerous division in the sport. Dana White called him the GOAT. Fans debated whether anyone in MMA history could match his resume, and Jones himself declared that he wanted Stipe Miocic next. For him, it was about cementing legacy, beating the man widely considered the greatest heavyweight in UFC history. But as Jones basked in his return, another storm was quietly building across the Atlantic. A fighter from Manchester was carving his own path, one defined not by years of dominance, but by explosive performances and the promise of a new era. His name was Tom Aspinall, and soon the world would be talking about him as the man Jon Jones had to fight. If Jon Jones's story is one of prodigy and dominance, Tom Aspinall's is one of persistence, evolution, and raw, untapped potential. Born in Salford, England, Aspinall grew up in a fighting family. His father, a jiu-jitsu instructor, introduced him to martial arts at a young age, and Tom developed a unique blend of boxing and grappling skills that would later make him one of the most well-rounded heavyweights in the UFC. Unlike many in his division, he wasn't just a striker or a wrestler, he was a complete fighter. Early in his UFC career, Aspinall immediately stood out. While most heavyweights relied on sheer size and knockout power, Aspinall moved like a middleweight. Fast footwork, crisp boxing, and fluid combinations. He blitzed opponents with a speed rarely seen in the division, finishing fights in the first round with frightening consistency. Each knockout wasn't just a win, it was a statement. But like every fighter's journey, Aspinall faced setbacks. In 2022, during a main event against Curtis Blades in London, he suffered a freak knee injury just seconds into the fight. For many fighters, an injury like that could derail momentum permanently. Fans wondered if he would ever return the same. Aspinall, however, used the time to rebuild. When he came back stronger. In November 2023, Aspinall was given the biggest opportunity of his career, a short-notice fight against Sergei Pavlovich for the interim heavyweight title. Pavlovich was considered one of the scariest punchers in the sport, riding a knockout streak that left a trail of destruction. Many expected chaos, and chaos is exactly what they got, just not in the way people predicted. Aspinall stunned the MMA world by finishing Pavlovich in just 69 seconds. He weathered the early storm, landed his shots, and folded one of the most feared heavyweights alive. The O2 Arena in London erupted, and Tom Aspinall had his hand raised as the interim heavyweight champion of the world. Overnight, he went from rising contender to superstar, from maybe the future to the future is now. But there was one problem. While Aspinall held the interim belt, Jon Jones held the undisputed one. And for Tom, being called interim champion wasn't enough. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted Jon Jones. And unlike other fighters, Aspinall wasn't shy about saying it. In interviews, he called Jones out directly. "If I want to be the best heavyweight in the world, I have to beat Jon Jones." The fans rallied behind him. Here was a young, hungry fighter with all the tools to push Jones like no one else had. But as Aspinall demanded his shot, Jones had other plans, and that's when the conflict really began. The clash between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall wasn't just about fists. It was about words, titles, and the meaning of legitimacy. On paper, Jones was the undisputed UFC heavyweight champion. He had returned from a 3-year layoff, destroyed Ciryl Gane, and taken the belt. Aspinall, meanwhile, had captured the interim title in spectacular fashion, cementing himself as the next in line. But in the eyes of fans, undisputed began to feel disputed. The UFC made its stance clear. Jones would fight Stipe Miocic. Dana White called it the biggest fight in heavyweight history. The greatest light heavyweight of all time versus the greatest heavyweight of all time. For Jones, it was the fight he wanted, the fight that would cement his GOAT status forever. But for Aspinall and his supporters, it felt like the UFC was protecting Jones, giving him a legacy fight instead of the real challenge. Aspinall didn't hold back. In interviews, he expressed frustration at being sidelined. He respected Jones's accomplishments, but he wasn't afraid to say what fans were thinking. "Jon doesn't want to fight me." He argued that if Jones truly wanted to prove himself at heavyweight, he should face the most dangerous opponent available. And right now, that was him. Jones responded in kind, though in his typical dismissive fashion. On social media, he brushed off Aspinall's callouts, telling him to wait his turn. He framed the Stipe fight as something bigger than the belt, bigger than the rankings. It was about legacy. Jones versus Miocic was history, he argued. Aspinall would have to wait. But waiting wasn't something Aspinall was interested in. He saw himself as the real threat, the man who could dethrone Jones. And fans began to agree. Debate raged online. Was Jones avoiding Aspinall? Or was Aspinall not yet worthy of a shot at the king? The conversation grew louder with every interview, every tweet, every podcast. The conflict became bigger than the fighters themselves. It became a debate about eras. Jones, the legend who had conquered everything, holding on to his legacy. Aspinall, the rising force demanding his chance to carve his own. The interim versus undisputed debate wasn't just semantics. It was a line drawn in the sand, and both men stood firmly on their side. And as the tension built, one name kept pulling the spotlight away from Aspinall's demands: Stipe Miocic. For Jones, Stipe was the only fight that mattered. For Aspinall, Stipe was just a distraction. And that tension would soon spill over into one of the most heated debates in modern MMA. For Jon Jones, the name Stipe Miocic carries weight far beyond a rankings chart. Miocic isn't just another contender. He's the most decorated heavyweight champion in UFC history. He holds the record for most title defenses, has beaten legends like Daniel Cormier, Francis Ngannou, Junior Dos Santos, and Alistair Overeem, and he represents the old guard of heavyweights. Blue-collar, humble, but undeniably great. To Jones, facing Stipe wasn't just another fight, it was an exclamation point on a career already argued as the best in MMA history. If he could take out Miocic, the greatest heavyweight of all time, while holding the belt himself, he would stand alone at the very top of the mountain. But while Jones looked backward to Stipe as his legacy fight, Tom Aspinall looked forward. He saw Miocic not as a dream matchup, but as a roadblock to the division's evolution. From his perspective, Stipe was past his prime, older, slower, and perhaps no longer the threat he once was. The real challenge, Aspinall argued, was the new generation, the men like himself who were rising with speed, power, and well-rounded skill sets. The conflict here wasn't just personal, it was philosophical. Jones wanted to write his final chapter against a name that would resonate through history books. Aspinall wanted to test himself against the best in the present, not the past. And this clash of visions sparked debate across the MMA world. Should Jones get to choose a legacy fight against an aging Stipe? Or should the UFC demand he face the most dangerous contender available, the fighter most fans believed was the real number one, Tom Aspinall? This split revealed a lot about how fans view greatness. Some argued Jones had already earned the right to choose, that after years of dominance he should be able to fight whoever he wanted for his final bow. Others accused him of ducking Aspinall, claiming he was protecting his legacy from a dangerous matchup that could tarnish it. Aspinall himself fueled the fire, openly stating that Jones was cherry-picking opponents and avoiding the future. While he was careful to respect Stipe's legacy, he made it clear that beating Miocic in 2024 wasn't the same as beating Miocic in his prime. And if Jones truly wanted to prove himself at heavyweight, Aspinall believed there was only one name that mattered, his. The UFC, of course, sided with Jones. Dana White repeatedly pushed the Jones-Miocic fight as the greatest heavyweight matchup of all time, ignoring Aspinall's demands. But outside the UFC offices, the noise kept building. Fans wanted Jones versus Aspinall, fighters chimed in too, with some supporting Jones's choice and others calling for the unification bout. The Stipe factor didn't just delay the fight, it magnified the tension. Every time Jones talked about Miocic, Aspinall's name became louder, and every time Aspinall dismissed Stipe as irrelevant, fans sharpened the narrative. Jon Jones was protecting his legacy, while Tom Aspinall was chasing it. As the months passed, the conflict between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall evolved from subtle digs to sharp public jabs. Aspinall, who had built his reputation as a respectful, soft-spoken fighter, began speaking out more directly. In interviews, he didn't mince words. "I want Jon Jones. That's the fight. That's the one that matters." He questioned Jones's willingness to fight him, suggesting that the champion was deliberately avoiding the matchup. For fans who already suspected Jones of cherry-picking Stipe, Aspinall's words poured gasoline on the fire. Jones, never one to stay quiet, fired back on Twitter. In his usual mix of dismissive arrogance and sarcastic humor, he brushed off Aspinall's call-outs. One of his most pointed responses was, "I don't have to prove anything to a kid who's still figuring out who he is in this division. Sit down, young man." For Jones, Aspinall hadn't earned the right to demand a fight. For Aspinall, Jones was dodging the reality that the division had already shifted beneath him. The back and forth escalated, with media amplifying every quote and tweet. MMA podcasts, YouTube channels, and mainstream outlets all framed it the same way. The king versus the challenger, the established GOAT versus the heir apparent. Some fighters chimed in too. Michael Bisping, the UK's first UFC champion, rallied behind Aspinall, saying the division needed new blood. Others, like Chael Sonnen, defended Jones's right to chase legacy over rankings. Aspinall's callouts grew bolder. He openly accused Jones of stalling, of being uninterested in fighting the best. "I want to fight the best version of Jon Jones, not a faded version years from now, not after Stipe, right now, because right now, I believe I can beat him." Statements like that struck a chord with fans who were already tired of waiting for Jones to truly defend his heavyweight crown. Meanwhile, Jones doubled down on Stipe. In interviews, he insisted that Aspinall wasn't on his radar. He praised Stipe as the true heavyweight GOAT and mocked the idea that Aspinall, with only a handful of high-level wins, could claim the throne. Jones framed Aspinall as a talented but inexperienced fighter who had yet to prove himself against the depth of competition. The sharp words didn't just create tension between the fighters, they created tension among fans. On one side were the Jones loyalists, who believed the champion had earned the right to fight for legacy. On the other were Aspinall supporters, who argued that the UFC was protecting Jones from a fight that could redefine the division. Every quote became a headline. Every tweet became a talking point. And slowly, what began began as a quiet clash between interim and undisputed champions became the hottest rivalry in the heavyweight division, without a single punch being thrown. At the heart of Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall lies a deeper conflict than titles or rankings. It's a clash of eras, of philosophies, of what greatness truly means in MMA. For Jones, the fight game has always been about legacy. He became the youngest champion in UFC history, dominated the light heavyweight division for over a decade, and returned from years of exile to claim heavyweight gold in minutes. For him, fighting Stipe Miocic is about sealing his place as the undisputed GOAT, the champion of champions, with victories over the greatest light heavyweight and heavyweight of all time. But for Aspinall, the fight game is about the future. He doesn't just want to beat names that history books already celebrate. He wants to define his own era. Aspinall represents the next generation of heavyweights, faster, more technical, more well-rounded than the lumbering sluggers of old. His rise, capped by the destruction of Sergei Pavlovich, symbolized a changing of the guard, and in his eyes, a division can't move forward while its champion looks backward. This philosophical divide is what makes the conflict so fascinating. Jones wants to cap his career with a fight that adds to his legacy. Aspinall wants to launch his career with a fight that proves he belongs in the conversation of all-time greats. And both men's goals clash directly with the others. If Jones fights Stipe, Aspinall is left waiting in the shadows. If Jones fights Aspinall, he risks tarnishing his legacy against a younger, fresher opponent. Analysts and fans frame the debate in broader terms. What matters more, fighting the best names in history or fighting the most dangerous threats in the present? For Jones, greatness is about building a resume that will stand forever. For Aspinall, greatness is about proving who the best truly is right now. The cultural backdrop adds another layer. Jones, the American champion whose career has spanned over a decade, represents the established power of the UFC. Aspinall, the English contender, represents the global expansion of MMA and the hunger of a new wave of European fighters. Their potential clash isn't just about two men. It's about old versus new, tradition versus change, legacy versus future. And as the conflict intensifies, the question grows louder. Will Jon Jones pass the torch willingly, or will Tom Aspinall have to rip it from his hands? The heavyweight division is unforgiving, not just inside the cage, but in the training room. In October 2023, the MMA world was rocked when Jon Jones tore a pectoral muscle while preparing for his fight with Stipe Miocic. The highly anticipated bout was cancelled, and suddenly, the heavyweight picture turned upside down. For Jones, the injury was a devastating setback. At 36 years old, with years of inactivity already behind him, questions swirled about whether he would ever truly return at full strength. For Aspinall, though, the injury opened a door. The UFC responded quickly, booking Tom Aspinall against Sergei Pavlovich for the interim heavyweight title at UFC 295. It was a short-notice fight with high stakes and enormous risk. Pavlovich was one of the most feared men in the sport, riding a streak of violent first-round knockouts. Many saw him as the most dangerous heavyweight alive, and some believed Aspinall was being thrown into the fire too soon. But what happened in Madison Square Garden was nothing short of stunning. Aspinall came out composed, sharp, and confident. He ate Pavlovich's best shots, then fired back with a counter combination that sent the Russian crashing to the canvas. Just 69 seconds into the fight, the referee waved it off. Tom Aspinall had become the interim heavyweight champion, and the crowd erupted in shock and celebration. This was the moment that cemented Aspinall as more than just a prospect. He was the real deal, a champion in everything but name. In interviews after the fight, he wasted no time calling out Jon Jones. "I want Jon. I want to unify this belt. That's the fight." The timing felt perfect. Jones was sidelined, Aspinall had momentum, and the fans were demanding it. But once again, the UFC made its stance clear. Jones would fight Stipe when he returned. Dana White doubled down, saying the Aspinall fight wasn't even on the table, and that decision only fueled the fire. Fans began to ask, if Jones is the undisputed champion, why is Aspinall carrying a belt? Why is the scariest man in the division not being given his chance? The injury twist had shifted the power dynamic. Before, Jones was the unquestioned champion, and Aspinall the rising contender. Now, Jones was out of action, and Aspinall was destroying boxing monsters in his absence. The court of public opinion began to tilt, and for the first time, Jon Jones's reign at heavyweight felt vulnerable. Not because of what happened in the cage, but because of what wasn't happening. What followed was less a fight and more a battle of perception. Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall weren't trading blows. They were trading narratives, and the MMA world became the arena. Jones's message was consistent. Stipe Miocic was his next fight, and legacy was the only thing on his mind. He praised Miocic as the true heavyweight GOAT and framed their clash as a dream matchup for the ages. For Jones, Aspinall wasn't part of the story. He hadn't earned the fight, hadn't proven himself enough, and wasn't relevant to Jones's goals. Aspinall, on the other hand, leaned into the opposite narrative. In interviews, he insisted that Jones was ducking him. He pointed out that the UFC was keeping him away from the real champion, and he questioned whether Jones truly wanted to test himself against the new era of heavyweights. If Jon wants to prove he's the best heavyweight in the world, he has to fight me. Fighting Stipe doesn't do that anymore. Fans and media took sides. Some agreed with Jones, arguing that legacy fights matter. Others rallied behind Aspinall, saying he was being denied his rightful shot. Twitter debates, podcast discussions, and YouTube breakdowns exploded with speculation. What made the situation so compelling was that both sides had truth to them. Jones had earned the right to fight Stipe, but Aspinall had earned the right to prove himself against Jones. The narrative war grew even sharper when fighters began to weigh in. Michael Bisping, a proud Englishman, defended Aspinall and argued that Jones was avoiding the toughest fight. Daniel Cormier, Jones's old rival, echoed the sentiment, saying Aspinall had earned his shot. Others, however, defended Jones's position, emphasizing that his legacy was already secure. What made this conflict unique was that no punches had been thrown, yet the stakes felt enormous. The division was split, the fan base was split, and even the UFC seemed caught between honoring a legend and promoting the future. The war of narratives was building to a boiling point, and everyone knew the only way to settle it would be inside the octagon. But the question loomed, would it ever actually happen? When fans talk about dream fights, they often imagine clashes across generations. Prime Anderson Silva versus Prime Israel Adesanya, Khabib versus Prime BJ Penn, Georges St. Pierre against Kamaru Usman. Most of those matchups are fantasy, but Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall? That one is real, and it could happen. And if it does, it might go down as the most important heavyweight fight in UFC history. For Jones, the fight would be the ultimate test of his legacy. Beating Aspinall would prove that he's not just the greatest of his era, but that he can defeat the new breed as well. It would silence critics who claim he's avoiding the most dangerous opponent in the division. It would be the fight that proves Jon Jones is truly untouchable. For Aspinall, the fight represents destiny. He doesn't just want to be champion, he wants to beat the greatest of all time. That's how you cement your name in history. If he defeats Jon Jones, he wouldn't just be the new champion. He'd be the man who retired the GOAT. And for a fighter who has risen so quickly, it would be the perfect coronation. Stylistically, the matchup is tantalizing. Jones's creativity, fight IQ, and experience against Aspinall's speed, power, and balance. Jones's wrestling against Aspinall's jiu-jitsu. Jones's elbows and oblique kicks against Aspinall's fluid boxing. It's a clash that feels both unpredictable and inevitable, a test of whether greatness can hold off evolution. And yet, the fight remains elusive. Jones insists on Stipe. Aspinall keeps knocking out contenders. The UFC has a choice: promote the legacy fight or the unification fight. Either way, one narrative will prevail and the other will fade. But until the day that cage door closes, Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall will remain the great what if of heavyweight history. Because when you strip everything else away, the titles, the interviews, the narratives, you're left with the essence of the sport. Two men, one ring, and the chance to decide not just who's champion, but who truly defines an era.